The helicopter's rotor blades beat against the morning sky like a mechanical heart, drowning out the screams below. Brown water surged through the streets of Espanola, New Mexico, carrying pieces of people's lives, a child's bicycle, a kitchen, table, someone's red pickup truck bobbing like a cork in the violent current. "Get back! Everyone get back from the edge!" The National Guard sergeant's voice cracked through the megaphone, but his words were swallowed by the roar of the flash flood that had transformed quiet residential streets into a raging river in less than 20 minutes. Families clutched each other on the higher ground of the evacuation zone, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. This was the high desert. This was New Mexico. Flash floods were supposed to be quick, predictable things that carved through arroyos and moved on. Not this. Not this monster that had swallowed entire neighborhoods whole. Through the chaos, a figure moved against the crowd. A girl, maybe 13 or 14, her dark hair whipping in the wind from the helicopters. She pushed through the mass of evacuees, her eyes scanning the churning water with desperate intensity. "Maya! Come back!" An older woman's voice rose above the din, but the girl kept moving, kept searching. There, trapped against a partially submerged car, an elderly man waved frantically. The water was rising around him, and the vehicle groaned ominously as the current tried to claim it. Without thinking, the girl stepped closer to the water's edge, her sneakers sliding on the muddy embankment. "Help him!" She screamed at the rescue workers, but they were already overwhelmed, their attention pulled in a dozen directions by a dozen other emergencies. The old man's grip on the car was failing. His weathered fingers, slick with muddy water, began to slip. The girl watched in horror as he disappeared beneath the surface for a moment, then bobbed up again, gasping and flailing. She couldn't just stand there. She wouldn't. The girl stepped into the water and immediately felt the shocking strength of the current. The muddy torrent was deceptively powerful, tugging at her legs with fingers that seemed determined to drag her down. She pushed deeper, reaching toward the drowning man, her hand outstretched. "No! Get back!" A K-9 handler in tactical gear lunged toward her, but he was too far away, too late. The ground beneath her feet crumbled. The riverbank, saturated and unstable, gave way with a wet, sucking sound. She felt herself falling, the world tilting sideways, as the angry brown water rushed up to meet her. The last thing she saw before the flood claimed her was the old man's terrified face, still 20 feet away, still beyond her reach. The water was shockingly cold despite the desert heat. It filled her mouth, her nose, her lungs. She tried to swim, but the current was too strong, too chaotic. Debris, a tree branch, a piece of roofing, slammed into her shoulder, spinning her around. She couldn't tell which way was up. Above the surface, the chaos erupted into something worse. The K-9 handler was screaming into his radio. The crowd was pressing forward, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed their helpless song. But cutting through it all was another sound, a deep, urgent bark that seemed to come from the very soul of the earth. A German shepherd, his coat dark with water and mud, broke free from his handler's grip with a violence that sent the man sprawling. The dog's eyes were fixed on the spot where the girl had disappeared, his entire body coiled with desperate energy. "Ranger, no! Stay!" The handler scrambled to his feet, reaching for the dog's collar, but it was too late. The K-9 launched himself into the floodwater without hesitation, his powerful body cutting through the current with a determination that defied the chaos around him. His paws churned against the muddy torrent, his head held high above the surface, dark eyes scanning for any sign of the girl who had vanished beneath the waves. The crowd fell silent for a moment, watching this display of raw courage and instinct. Even the helicopter seemed to hover lower, as if the pilot himself was transfixed by the sight of the dog fighting against impossible odds. Ranger's bark echoed across the water, a sound of pure anguish and determination. He dove beneath the surface, his form disappearing into the murky depths. Seconds stretched like hours. The handler stood at the water's edge, his face pale with horror at what he'd been unable to prevent. Then, incredibly, the dog's head broke. The surface again, and clutched in his jaws was a piece of fabric, the girl's blue jacket. She was unconscious, her body limp in the water, but Ranger held her with the gentleness of a mother carrying her pup. The current fought him with every stroke, threatening to tear his precious burden away. Debris swirled around them like deadly confetti, but the dog refused to let go. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he kept swimming, kept fighting, kept believing that somehow, some way, he could save her. The girl's face was pale as paper, her lips tinged with blue. Water streamed from her mouth and nose, but Ranger's powerful jaws held her steady, his swimming keeping her head above the surface as much as possible. A rescue worker in a wetsuit plunged into the water from a bridge upstream, swimming hard to intercept them. The crowd pressed forward, holding their breath, praying to whatever gods might be listening that they wouldn't witness a double tragedy. Ranger's strength was failing. His swimming became more labored, more desperate. The girl's weight and the relentless current were taking their toll, but still he held on. Still he fought. "Come on, boy," the handler whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Come on." The dog's eyes met his handler's across the churning water, and in that moment something passed between them. An understanding, a promise, a bond that transcended words. Ranger's tail, still visible above the surface, gave the faintest wag. He was going to save her, or die trying. The rescue worker was getting closer, his strokes powerful and sure. The crowd began to cheer, their voices rising above the helicopter's roar. But Ranger wasn't listening to them. All of his attention was focused on the girl in his jaws, the girl who had somehow become his entire world in the space of a few desperate seconds. Her eyelids fluttered. Just for a moment, just barely, but enough to give him hope. "Hold on," his every movement seemed to say. "Just hold on." 2 weeks earlier, the same streets had been dry and dusty, shimmering in the late afternoon heat that made the air dance above the asphalt. Maya Rodriguez sat in the passenger seat of a dusty Ford pickup, watching the adobe houses scroll past through the window. Her social worker, Mrs. Chen, kept stealing glances at her through the rearview mirror, her expression a mixture of hope and concern. "She's a good woman," Mrs. Chen said, not for the first time. Elena Torres, 25 years with the State Police K-9 unit before she retired. She's been fostering kids for 3 years now, and she specifically asked for you. Maya didn't respond. She'd learned not to get her hopes up. This was her 7th placement in 4 years, and the pattern was always the same. A few weeks or months of tentative kindness, then the realization that she was too quiet, too damaged, too much work. The phone calls would start, the hushed conversations, and then Mrs. Chen would arrive with her sad smile and her clipboard, ready to move Maya along to the next temporary home. The truck turned onto a gravel road that led to a small ranch house surrounded by cottonwood trees. The yard was neat but lived in, with a vegetable garden and a chain-link kennel that looked like it had seen better days. A woman emerged from the house as they pulled up, tall and lean, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. "That's Elena," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carefully, cheerful. "She's excited to meet you." Maya doubted that. Adults were never really excited to meet her. They were hopeful, maybe, or determined, but excitement faded quickly when they realized she wasn't going to be the grateful, chatty child they'd imagined. Elena Torres approached the truck with the measured gait of someone accustomed to dealing with unpredictable situations. She was wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt, her hands calloused from years of handling working dogs. When she smiled, it reached her eyes, but there was something else there too, a kind of patient watchfulness that Maya recognized from her own mirror. "Maya," Elena said as the girl climbed out of the truck, "I'm glad you're here." She didn't try to hug her or ruffle her hair or do any of the other things that well-meaning adults always did. She just stood there, giving Maya space to decide how close she wanted to get. "Thanks," Maya mumbled, shouldering her backpack. It contained everything she owned. A few changes of clothes, some books, and a small wooden horse that had been her mother's. Everything else was in the garbage bag that Mrs. Chen was pulling from the truck bed. "I'll help you get settled," Elena said. "And then, if you want, I'll introduce you to Ranger." Maya's head snapped up. "Ranger?" "My partner?" "Well, my former partner. He's retired now, like me." Elena's expression softened. "He's been looking forward to meeting you, too." The house was small but comfortable, with saltillo tile floors and, exposed wooden beams. Elena led Maya to a bedroom that had clearly been prepared for her arrival. Fresh sheets on the bed, a small desk by the window, and a bookshelf that held a collection of young adult novels and dog training manuals. "I wasn't sure what you liked to read," Elena said, noting Maya's glance at the books. "But I figured we could start there and see what interests you." Maya set her backpack on the bed and looked around the room. It was nice. Too nice. She'd learned not to get attached to nice things. "Where's Ranger?" she asked. Elena's smile was genuine this time. "Out back. He's probably wondering what all the commotion is about. Want to meet him?" The backyard was bigger than it had looked from the front, with a covered patio and a large fenced area where a dog could run. But the German shepherd lying in the shade of a cottonwood tree wasn't running. He was watching them with intelligent brown eyes, his head resting on his paws. "Ranger," Elena called. "Come here, boy." The dog rose slowly, favoring his right rear leg, and approached with the dignified bearing of a canine statesman. He was beautiful, black and tan coat gleaming in the afternoon sun, ears erect and alert, but Maya could see the gray around his muzzle that spoke of his age. "He's 8, Elena explained. "Got hurt in a drug bust about 6 months ago. Took some shrapnel in his leg. The vet says he'll always have a limp, but he's still the smartest dog I've ever worked with." Ranger stopped a few feet away from Maya, his tail wagging slowly. He didn't approach her directly, didn't try to sniff her or jump on her. Instead, he sat down and waited, his head tilted slightly to one side. "He's beautiful," Maya said softly. It was the first genuine emotion she'd shown since arriving. "He is," Elena agreed. "And he's a good judge of character. He doesn't warm up to everyone. But he seems to like you already." Maya looked at the dog, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that she recognized. A kind of careful wariness, a reluctance to trust too quickly. He'd been hurt too, she realized. Maybe not in the same way, but hurt nonetheless. She extended her hand slowly, palm up, and waited. Ranger considered for a moment, then took a step forward and sniffed her fingers. His tail wagged a little faster. "Hi, Ranger," she whispered. The dog's response was immediate and startling. He pressed his head against her palm, his tail wagging. With genuine enthusiasm now. Maya felt something inside her chest loosen, just a little. "Well," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral, "I think you two are going to get along just fine." That night, Maya lay in her new bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. She'd been in enough foster homes to know the routine, the careful politeness, the gradual establishment of rules and boundaries, the inevitable moment when she'd do something wrong and the atmosphere would shift from hopeful to disappointed. But there was something different about this place. Elena hadn't hovered or asked too many questions. She'd made dinner, grilled chicken and vegetables from her garden, and they'd eaten mostly in companionable silence. Ranger had lain at Maya's feet under the table, his presence somehow comforting. Soft scratching at her bedroom door made her sit up. She patted across the cool tile floor and opened it to find Ranger standing in the hallway, his tail wagging tentatively. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. The dog tilted his head and whined softly, then looked toward the living room and back at her. An invitation. Maya followed him down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the tile. Ranger led her to the back door, where he sat and looked up at her expectantly. "You want to go out?" The dog's tail thumped once against the floor. Maya opened the door and stepped onto the patio. The night air was cool and clean, filled with the scent of sage and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the desert. Ranger padded to the center of the yard and lay down, his muzzle resting on his paws as he gazed up at the star-filled sky. Maya sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. They stayed like that for a long time, neither of them speaking, just existing in the peaceful darkness together. "I don't stay places very long," Maya finally whispered. "Just so you know." Ranger's tail thumped softly against the ground, but he didn't move. He just kept watching the stars, as if he understood that some things didn't need words. The morning sun painted the Sangre de Cristo mountains in shades of gold and rose as Maya stepped onto the back patio, a cup of cocoa warming her hands. It had been a week since she'd arrived at Elena's house, and already she'd fallen into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Ranger was waiting for her, as he did every morning, sitting patiently by the back door with his leash in his mouth. It was their ritual now, a morning walk through the arroyos and desert trails that surrounded Elena's property. Elena had suggested it on Maya's second day, noting that both the girl and the dog seemed restless in the confines of the yard. "He knows these trails better than I do," Elena had said. "Let him show you around." At first, Maya had been nervous about venturing into the desert alone with just a dog for company, but Ranger had a way of making her feel safe. His presence, solid and reassuring as they picked their way through the scrub brush and red rock formations. He seemed to know instinctively when she needed to rest, when she was ready to explore further, when the silence between them was exactly what she needed. This morning was different, though. As they walked along the familiar path that led to Maya's favorite spot, a small rise overlooking the Rio Grande Valley, Ranger suddenly stopped, his body going rigid with alertness. "What is it, boy?" Maya asked, following his gaze. The dog's ears were forward, his tail held high and still. A low growl rumbled in his throat, so quiet that Maya almost missed it. Then she saw what had caught his attention. A thick, diamond-patterned shape coiled in the shade of a piñon pine, not 10 feet from where they stood. "Rattlesnake?" Maya's breath caught in her throat. The snake was massive, easily 4 feet long, and its triangular head was raised in a defensive posture. The distinctive rattle at the end of its tail buzzed a warning that made Maya's skin crawl. She started to take a step backward, but Ranger moved faster. The dog positioned himself between Maya and the snake, his body low and tense, every muscle coiled for action. The growl in his throat deepened to something primal and protective. "Easy, Ranger," Maya whispered, her voice shaking. "Easy." But the dog wasn't listening to her. All of his attention was focused on the snake, which had begun to move, slithering slowly toward a cluster of rocks where it could find better shelter. The movement triggered something in Ranger's training, or maybe just his instincts, and he lunged forward with a sharp bark. The snake struck with lightning speed, its fangs flashing in the morning sun. But Ranger was faster, his police training evident in the way he dodged and weaved, harassing the rattlesnake without getting close enough to be bitten. He was hurting it, Maya realized, using his body and his voice to drive the snake away from her and toward the rocks where it wanted to go anyway. It worked. The rattlesnake, apparently deciding that this particular patch of desert wasn't worth the fight, slithered into the rocks and disappeared. Ranger stood guard for another moment, his tail still bristling, then turned back to Maya with what could only be described as a satisfied expression. "Good boy," Maya breathed, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. "Good boy, Ranger." The dog's tail wagged slowly, and he leaned into her embrace with a contented sigh. Maya buried her face in his fur, breathing in his warm, familiar scent. He'd protected her. This damaged, retired police dog had put himself between her and danger without a moment's hesitation. "Thank you," she whispered into his ear. "Thank you." That afternoon, Maya found Elena in the kitchen preparing lunch. The older woman looked up as Maya entered, noting the girl's flushed cheeks and bright eyes. "Good walk?" Elena asked. "We saw a rattlesnake," Maya said, and Elena's hands stilled on the sandwich she was making. "Are you okay? Did it?" "Ranger protected me," Maya interrupted, her voice filled with wonder. "He got between me and the snake, and he made it go away. He was so brave." Elena's expression softened. "That's what he does, what he was trained to do, protect people. But he's retired," Maya said. "He doesn't have to protect anyone anymore." "Maybe not," Elena agreed, "but some things run deeper than training. Some things are just part of who you are." That evening, Maya sat on the porch with Ranger at her feet, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. She'd been thinking about Elena's words all day, about the idea that some things were just part of who you were. "I don't know who I am yet," she said to the dog, "but I know I want to be brave like you." Ranger's tail thumped against the wooden planks of the porch, and he lifted his head to look at her. There was something in his eyes. Understanding, maybe, or recognition, as if he knew exactly what she meant. The next morning brought a different kind of adventure. Elena had errands to run in town, and she'd asked Maya if she wanted to come along. But Maya had looked at Ranger, stretched out in his favorite spot of morning sun, and shook her head. "I think I'll stay here," she said. "Keep Ranger company." Elena had smiled. "I think he'd like that. Just don't go too far from the house, okay?" Maya nodded, but as soon as Elena's truck disappeared down the gravel road, she and Ranger set off for the trails. She'd found a new path the day before, one that led deeper into the desert than she'd ever gone, and she was curious to see where it led. The trail wound through a landscape of red rock and sage, climbing steadily toward a mesa that rose like a giant table from the desert floor. Ranger seemed to know where they were going, his step confident and sure as he led the way. They climbed for over an hour, stopping frequently to rest and drink from the water bottle Maya had brought. The dog seemed to understand her limitations, never pushing too hard or too fast. When she needed to catch her breath, he would find shade and lie down, waiting patiently for her to be ready to continue. The top of the mesa was worth the climb. Maya stood at the edge, looking out over miles of desert and distant mountains, feeling like she was standing on top of the world. Ranger sat beside her, his ears pricked forward as he watched a hawk circle in the thermals below. "It's beautiful," Maya said, and meant it. This was the first time in years that she'd felt truly peaceful, truly safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, as if she could be herself here, without pretense or fear. Ranger leaned against her leg, his warm weight reassuring. Maya reached down and scratched behind his ears, marveling at how soft his fur was. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. It was the first time she'd said those words to anyone or anything since her mother died. The dog's tail wagged slowly, and he nuzzled her hand with his nose. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, warm and healing. They made their way back down the mesa as the sun began to set, taking their time and enjoying the journey. Maya felt different somehow, lighter, more hopeful, as if the walls she'd built around her heart had developed a crack that was slowly widening. When they reached the house, Elena was waiting on the porch, her face creased with worry. "Where have you been?" she asked. "I've been worried sick." "We went up to the mesa," Maya said. "I'm sorry, I should have left a note." Elena's expression softened as she saw the genuine remorse in Maya's eyes. "Next time, just let me know where you're going, okay? I need to know you're safe." Maya nodded, then looked at Elena with curious eyes. "Were you really worried?" "Of course I was worried," Elena said. "I care about you, Maya. You're not just another foster kid to me. You're becoming part of the family." The words hit Maya like a physical blow. Family. It was a word she'd almost forgotten, a concept that had seemed impossibly distant for so long. But looking at Elena's worried face and feeling Ranger's solid presence beside her, Maya began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd found her way home. That night, as Maya lay in bed with Ranger curled up on the rug beside her, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next few weeks or months. A future where she didn't have to pack her few belongings into a garbage bag and start over somewhere new. A future where she could put down roots and grow. Outside, the desert night was full of sounds. The distant call of coyotes, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods, the soft hoot of an owl. But inside the house, all was peaceful and quiet. Maya closed her eyes and let herself drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that Ranger was there, watching over her dreams. The weather began to change on a Tuesday morning in late August, though at first the signs were so subtle that most people missed them entirely. Maya noticed because she'd become attuned to the desert's rhythms during her walks with Ranger, learning to read the landscape like a book written in stone and sky. The air felt different, heavier somehow, despite the fact that there wasn't a cloud in the azure sky. Ranger seemed to sense it too, his usual enthusiasm for their morning hike replaced by a restless energy that had him constantly pausing to sniff the air and scan the horizon. "What's wrong, boy?" Maya asked as they stood on their favorite ridge overlooking the Rio Grande Valley. The dog's ears were forward, his body tense with an alertness that she'd never seen before. Ranger whined softly, a sound that sent an unexpected chill down Maya's spine. In the 3 weeks since she'd arrived at Elena's house, she'd never heard him make that particular sound. It was worried, almost fearful. Below them, the normally dry arroyos showed no signs of moisture, their sandy bottoms baked hard by the relentless summer sun. The Rio Grande itself was running low, exposing sandbars and mudflats that had been underwater earlier in the season. Everything looked exactly as it should in the high desert of northern New Mexico. But something was wrong. Maya could feel it. In her bones, a prickle of unease that had nothing to do with the oppressive heat. That afternoon, Elena came home from town with groceries and a worried expression that matched Ranger's earlier mood. Maya was in the kitchen, reading one of the dog training manuals from her bookshelf, when Elena set the bags on the counter with more force than necessary. "Everything okay?" Maya asked, looking up from her book. Elena glanced at her, then at Ranger, who was lying at Maya's feet. "Weather Service is predicting storms for the weekend. Big ones, maybe." Maya frowned. "That's good, right? We need the rain." "Sometimes," Elena said slowly, "the rain comes too fast for the ground to absorb it, especially when it's been dry for so long. The soil gets hard, like concrete. When that happens, the water has nowhere to go but down." She gestured toward the window where the dry arroyos were visible in the distance. "Those creek beds haven't seen water in months, but when they do—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Maya understood. Flash floods. She'd heard about them in school, learned about the dangers of desert storms and the wall of water that could appear without warning in places that had been bone dry moments before. "How bad could it be?" Maya asked. Elena was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands methodically unpacking groceries. "Probably nothing. The forecasters are wrong more often than they're right out here, but I've been doing this long enough to know that when the animals start acting strange, you pay attention." As if summoned by her words, Ranger lifted his head and whined again, that same worried sound from earlier. Elena looked at him with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades reading the moods and signals of working dogs. "He's been like this all day," Maya said. "Nervous, jumpy. I thought maybe he was getting sick." "No," Elena said softly. "He's not sick. He's scared." The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Ranger, scared. The dog who'd faced down a rattlesnake without hesitation, who'd spent years chasing armed criminals through dark buildings and dangerous streets. That evening, Maya and Ranger took a longer walk than usual, following the main arroyo that ran behind Elena's property. The sandy bottom was cracked and dry, marked only by the tracks of rabbits and coyotes. But as they walked, Maya noticed something that made her stop and stare. There, in the deepest part of the channel, was a thin line of moisture. Not flowing water exactly, but a dark stain in the sand that hadn't been there the day before. "Look, Ranger," she said, pointing. "Water." The dog approached the dark sand carefully, sniffing at the moisture with obvious concern. His hackles rose slightly, and he backed away from the arroyo with a sharp bark. Maya knelt and touched the damp sand with her fingertips. It was cool and slightly muddy, definitely water. But where was it coming from? The sky was still clear, the sun still blazing down with August intensity. "It's probably just a spring," she said to Ranger, but her voice lacked conviction. She'd walked this arroyo dozens of times in the past 3 weeks, and there had never been any sign of water. That night, Maya lay awake listening to the sounds of the desert, but the familiar symphony of crickets and distant coyotes was interrupted by something new, a low, almost subsonic rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. She got up and went to the window, pressing her face against the cool glass. In the distance, she could see flashes of light on the horizon, not lightning exactly, but something like it. Heat lightning, maybe, or the reflection of storms too far away to hear. Ranger was awake too, she noticed. The dog was lying by her. Bedroom door, his head raised and alert, his ears pricked forward as he listened to sounds that she couldn't hear. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, but he didn't move from his guard position. Maya had the strange feeling that he was protecting her from something, though she couldn't imagine what. The next morning brought the first real clouds Maya had seen since arriving in New Mexico, towering thunderheads that built up over the mountains like white castles in the sky. The air was thick and humid, so different from the dry heat she'd grown accustomed to that it felt almost foreign. Elena was on the phone when Maya came into the kitchen, her voice tight with concentration, as she spoke to someone about emergency supplies and evacuation routes. Maya caught fragments of the conversation. Flash flood warnings and National Weather Service and better safe than sorry. When Elena hung up, she turned to Maya with an expression that tried to be reassuring but didn't quite succeed. "Just precautionary measures," she said. "The county likes to be prepared. But Maya could see the worry in her eyes, could hear the slight tremor in her voice. Elena was scared too, though she was trying not to show it. That afternoon, they drove into town to stock up on supplies: bottled water, canned food, batteries, a weather radio. The grocery store was crowded with people who had the same idea, their faces reflecting the same mixture of concern and skepticism that Maya felt. "Probably nothing," she heard one man say to his wife as they loaded cases of water into their cart. "But you never know." "Better safe than sorry," the woman replied, echoing Elena's earlier words. On the drive home, Maya noticed that the thin trickle of water in the arroyo had grown into a small stream. Not rushing or dangerous, just a gentle flow that caught the afternoon light and sparkled like scattered diamonds. "Elena," she said, pointing. "Look." Elena pulled over, and they both stared at the water. It was beautiful, actually. The first flowing water Maya had seen in the desert. But Elena's face was grim. "Runoff from the mountains," she said. "The storms are already starting up there." "Is that bad?" Elena was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow toward the Rio Grande. "Not necessarily, but it means the storms are real, and they're big, and all that water has to go somewhere." That night, Maya stood on the back porch with Ranger, watching the lightning dance across the northern sky. The flashes were getting closer, she could tell, and the rumble of thunder was beginning to reach them, low and ominous. Ranger pressed against her legs, his warmth comforting in the suddenly cool air. The dog was still nervous, still alert, but his presence beside her made Maya feel safer somehow. "We'll be okay," she said, as much to convince herself as to reassure him. Elena knows what she's doing, but even as she spoke the words, Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Something was coming, something bigger than just rain and wind. She could feel it in the way the air seemed to hum with electricity, in the way the normally fearless Ranger stayed so close to her side. The first drops of rain began to fall just as they went back inside, fat drops that splattered on the dust of the patio with tiny explosions. Maya pressed her face to the window and watched the storm approach, a wall of darkness that swallowed the stars as it moved across the desert toward them. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and it was. But it was also terrifying, this display of nature's raw power bearing down on their small house in the middle of nowhere. Behind her, Ranger whined softly, and Maya turned to see him watching her with those intelligent brown eyes. There was something in his expression, a kind of desperate communication that she couldn't quite understand. "What is it, boy?" she asked. "What are you trying to tell me?" But the dog just moved closer to her, his solid presence both comforting and somehow ominous, as if he knew something that she didn't, something that words couldn't express. Outside, the storm was getting closer, and with it, a danger that neither of them could yet imagine. The sirens started at 4:47 a.m., their wailing cry cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Maya jolted awake, her heart pounding as the sound echoed across the desert, bouncing off the canyon walls and arroyos in a terrifying symphony of warning. She stumbled to her bedroom window, pressing her face against the glass. The sky was still dark, but she could see lights moving in the distance, emergency vehicles, their red and blue strobes painting the landscape in hellish colors. The rain that had started the night before had intensified into something monstrous, sheets of water driven by winds that howled like living things. "Maya!" Elena's voice came from the hallway, sharp with urgency. "We need to go. Now!" Maya grabbed her backpack, the same one she'd arrived with 3 weeks ago, the one that held everything important to her. Her hands shook as she stuffed her few belongings inside, muscle memory taking over from her years of emergency departures from foster homes. But this was different. This time, she didn't want to leave. Ranger was waiting for her in the hallway, his leash already clipped to his collar, but the dog's usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an agitation that made Maya's stomach clench with fear. His ears were flat against his head, his eyes wide and alert. "The arroyos are flooding," Elena said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The National Weather Service is calling for immediate evacuation of all low-lying areas. We need to get to higher ground." Maya could hear it now, the sound that had been haunting her dreams for the past 2 days. But it was no longer distant or subtle. It was a roar, deep and primal, like the voice of an angry god, the sound of water, lots of water. They rushed outside into the storm, and Maya gasped as the wind hit her like a physical blow. The rain was coming down in torrents now, not the gentle desert shower she'd been expecting, but a deluge that turned the world into a blur of gray and brown. The ground beneath their feet was already saturated, water pooling in every depression and running off the hard-packed earth in rivers. Elena's truck was parked in the driveway, and they ran for it through the driving rain. Ranger leaped into the back seat with Maya, his wet fur plastered to his body, his breathing rapid and shallow. The dog's distress was palpable, and Maya wrapped her arms around him, trying to offer comfort even as her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. "It's okay," she whispered into his ear. "We're going to be okay." But even as she spoke the words, Maya could see that they might not be true. Through the truck's rain-streaked windows, she watched the small stream in the arroyo behind their house transform into something unrecognizable. What had been a gentle trickle the day before was now a raging torrent, brown with mud and debris, rising with terrifying speed. Elena gunned the engine, and they lurched forward onto the gravel road. But they'd only gone a few hundred yards when she slammed on the brakes, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white. "Oh, God," she breathed. Ahead of them, the road simply ended. Where there had been a small concrete bridge over a normally dry wash, there was now a gap filled with churning brown water. The bridge was gone, swept away by the flood as if it had never existed. "We'll have to go around," Elena said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Take the back road to—" She was interrupted by the sound of her radio crackling to life. A voice, distorted by static but unmistakably urgent, filled the cab of the truck. All units. We have a dam breach at Cochiti. Repeat, dam breach." At Cochiti. Estimated time to populated areas, 30 minutes. All emergency personnel to evacuation stations immediately. Elena's face went pale. Maya didn't understand all the technical terms, but she understood the fear in Elena's voice when she grabbed the radio and responded. "Unit 47. This is Torres. I'm cut off on County Road 12 with a civilian. Bridge is out. Request immediate assistance." The response came back immediately. "Torres, negative on assistance. All units committed to population centers. You need to get to high ground now. Do not attempt to cross flooded areas." Elena stared at the radio for a moment, then looked at Maya with an expression that tried to be reassuring but fell short. "We're going to be fine," she said. "We just need to get to higher ground." She put the truck in reverse and began backing up, looking for another route. But as they turned around, Maya saw something that made her heart stop. The water in the arroyo wasn't just rising, it was advancing, spreading out across the normally dry desert like a living thing, swallowing everything in its path. "Elena," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look." Elena followed her gaze and cursed under her breath. The flood was moving faster than seemed possible, a wall of brown water and debris that was already cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. "The house," Elena said. "We need to get back to the house, get on the roof." But as they watched, the small ranch house where Maya had found her first real home in years was engulfed by the advancing water. The front porch disappeared first, then the windows. Then the roof itself vanished beneath the churning surface. Everything was gone. The bedroom where Maya had felt safe for the first time in years, the kitchen where Elena had made her feel like family, the back porch where she and Ranger had watched the sunset together. All of it swept away in a matter of minutes. "The mesa," Elena said suddenly. "We can get to the mesa. It's high enough." She turned the truck toward the trail that Maya and Ranger had hiked so many times, but the path was already underwater. The truck's engine coughed and sputtered as they tried to push through the rising water, and Maya could feel the vehicle starting to float, losing traction with the ground. "We're going to have to run for it," Elena said. "Stay close to me, and whatever happens, don't let go of Ranger." They abandoned the truck and plunged into the knee-deep water, fighting against the current that tried to sweep them away. Maya's grip on Ranger's leash was the only thing that kept her anchored as they struggled toward higher ground. The water was shockingly cold and full of debris. Tree branches, pieces of buildings, things that Maya couldn't identify in the chaos. Something slammed into her legs, nearly knocking her down, but Elena's strong hand grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. "Keep moving," Elena shouted over the roar of the water. "Don't stop." They were almost to the base of the mesa when Maya heard it, a sound that cut through even the noise of the flood. A child's voice, high and terrified, calling for help, calling for help. She turned and saw him through the driving rain. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, clinging to a tree that was already half submerged. He was maybe 50 feet away, but the water between them was deep and fast, full of debris that could kill. "Help me," the boy screamed. "Please help me." Elena saw him too, and Maya watched her foster mother's face transform with anguish. The woman was a trained emergency responder, someone who'd spent her career running toward danger instead of away from it. But she also had Maya to protect, and the water was rising too fast. "We can't," Elena said, her voice breaking. "Maya, we can't reach him." But Maya was already moving, already letting go of Elena's hand and stepping deeper into the flood. She couldn't just stand there and watch a child die. She couldn't. "Maya, no!" Elena screamed, but the girl was already committed, already fighting, her way through the churning water toward the boy in the tree. The current was stronger than she'd imagined, and colder. It pulled at her legs, trying to sweep her away, but she kept moving forward, her eyes fixed on the terrified child ahead of her. She was almost there when her foot slipped on something. A rock, a piece of debris. She never knew what. The water closed over her head, and suddenly she was tumbling, spinning, completely at the mercy of the flood. Maya fought to surface, to breathe, but the water was too chaotic, too powerful. She felt herself being carried away from the boy, away from Elena, away from everything safe and familiar. Her last coherent thought before the flood claimed her was of Ranger, and the way he'd looked at her that morning with those intelligent, brown eyes, as if he'd known this was going to happen, as if he'd been trying to warn her. Then the water closed over her head, and everything went dark. Above the surface, Elena's screams mixed with the roar of the flood as she watched the girl disappear beneath the churning brown water. And somewhere in the chaos, a German shepherd's bark rose above it all, desperate, anguished, determined. Ranger had seen his girl go under, and no force on earth was going to stop him from going after her. The world beneath the flood was a nightmare of brown chaos and crushing pressure. Maya tumbled through the underwater darkness, her lungs burning as she fought against the urge to breathe. The current spun her like a rag doll, slamming her into submerged objects she couldn't see. A car bumper, a fence post, debris that cut and bruised her already battered body. She tried to swim upward, but in the murky water she couldn't tell which way was up. Her clothes were heavy, dragging her down, and the backpack on her shoulders had become a deadly weight. Panic clawed at her mind as her oxygen-starved brain began to shut down. Above the surface, Ranger's powerful legs churned through the floodwater with desperate determination. His handlers' shouts were lost in the roar of the storm. But the dog's entire world had narrowed to a single focus: find Maya. The scent trail was impossible to follow in the churning water, but Ranger had something more powerful than his nose guiding him, an inexplicable bond that pulled him toward the girl who had become his entire reason for being. His thick coat was already waterlogged, making each stroke more difficult, but he pressed on. The current fought him with every yard, trying to sweep him downstream, but Ranger's police training had taught him to work through pain, through exhaustion, through fear. A piece of roofing debris slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around, but he quickly righted himself and kept swimming. His dark eyes scanned the churning surface, looking for any sign of Maya. A flash of blue from her jacket, a glimpse of dark hair, anything that might tell him where she was. Beneath the water, Maya's consciousness was fading, the burning in. Her lungs had given way to a strange, peaceful numbness. She was sinking now, her body too heavy to fight the current anymore. The muddy water pressed against her from all sides, and she found herself thinking about the mesa where she and Ranger had shared so many peaceful moments. That's when she saw him, a dark shape moving through the water above her with powerful, purposeful strokes. For a moment, her oxygen-starved brain wondered if she was hallucinating. But then she saw his eyes, those intelligent brown eyes that had looked at her with such understanding on that first day, and she knew he was real. Ranger had found her. The dog dove deeper, his lungs burning as he fought against his natural buoyancy. His powerful legs kicked frantically as he descended toward Maya's sinking form. The water was darker here, filled with sediment and debris that made visibility almost impossible, but Ranger's training kicked in. He'd done water rescues before, had pulled drowning suspects from rivers and lakes during his years of service. But this was different. This wasn't a criminal he was apprehending. This was his girl, his family, the person who had shown him what it meant to be loved unconditionally. His jaws clamped down on the collar of Maya's jacket, and immediately he felt the dead weight of her unconscious body. She was heavier than he'd expected, waterlogged and limp, but Ranger's powerful neck muscles strained against the load. He kicked upward with everything he had, fighting against the current that seemed determined to drag them both down. The surface seemed impossibly far away. Ranger's lungs screamed for air, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision. But he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. His head broke the surface with an explosive gasp, and he immediately adjusted his grip on Maya's jacket, tilting her head back to keep her face above water. She was unconscious, her lips blue with oxygen deprivation. But she was alive. He could feel her heart beating against his chest as he held her. But their ordeal was far from over. The floodwater was still rising, and the current was carrying them downstream at terrifying speed. Ranger paddled desperately, trying to angle them toward the shore, but the bank was too far away and the water too fast. A concrete culvert rushed toward them, and Ranger barely managed to push Maya's limp body aside before the structure would have crushed her skull. The near miss sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system, and he redoubled his efforts, his powerful legs churning through the water with renewed strength. Then he saw it, a cottonwood tree, its thick trunk still partially above water, its branches reaching toward the sky like the arms of a drowning giant. If he could reach it, if he could get Maya to that tree, Ranger angled his body toward the cottonwood, using every ounce of his strength and training to fight against the current. His muscles burned with exhaustion, and his waterlogged coat felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but he kept swimming. Maya's life depended on it. The tree rushed toward them, and Ranger managed to grab one of the lower branches with his teeth, his jaws clamping down on the bark with desperate strength. The sudden stop sent a shock through his system, and for a moment he thought he might lose his grip on Maya's jacket, but he held on. Through sheer force of will and the kind of determination that had made him a legendary police dog, Ranger held on to both the tree and the girl. With careful movements, he maneuvered Maya's body toward the tree trunk, using his nose to push her against the rough bark. Her arms hung limp at her sides, and her face was still that terrifying shade of blue, but she was out of the water. That had to count for something. Ranger barked once, a sound that was part triumph and part desperate plea for help. But his voice was lost in the roar of the storm, and there was no one to hear him anyway. Elena was somewhere upstream, probably swept away by the same flood that had claimed them. The emergency responders were dealing with disasters throughout the region. They were alone. Maya's body convulsed suddenly, and muddy water poured from her mouth and nose. Ranger's tail wagged frantically as he watched her body fight to expel the flood from her lungs. She was alive, unconscious and probably hypothermic, but alive. He positioned himself between Maya and the rushing water, using his body as a shield against the debris that continued to hurtle past. A car door slammed into his hip, sending a bolt of pain through his injured leg, but he didn't move. He couldn't move. Maya needed him. The storm raged around them, but Ranger's world had narrowed to the small space between the tree trunk and the girl he'd sworn to protect. He licked her face gently, trying to stimulate circulation, trying to will her back to consciousness. "Come on," he seemed to say with every movement. "Come back to me." Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the chaos of the flood. Ranger's strength was fading, his body battered by debris and exhaustion, but he refused to let go. He'd found her once in the churning water, pulled her from the depths when all hope seemed lost. He wasn't going to lose her now. The storm began to weaken, and the first gray light of dawn crept across the horizon. Maya's eyelids fluttered. Ranger's bark of joy was the sweetest sound she'd ever heard, even though she was too weak to respond. She was alive. They were both alive, and somehow, against all odds, they were going to make it through this together. The cottonwood tree that had saved their lives became their prison as the hours crawled by. Maya drifted in and out of consciousness, her body shaking with hypothermia despite the desert heat that was beginning to build as the sun climbed higher. Ranger pressed his warm body against her, sharing what little heat he could generate, but he could feel her growing weaker. The floodwater had begun to recede, but slowly, revealing a landscape that Maya barely recognized. Where familiar desert had been, there was now a muddy wasteland littered with debris. Cars sat at impossible angles, wrapped around trees or buried in silt. Mobile homes had been reduced to scattered pieces of aluminum and wood scattered across the desert floor like a giant's discarded toys. Ranger's injured leg throbbed where the car door had struck him, and his shoulders ached from the strain of holding Maya above water for so long. But he couldn't rest. Not yet. His training told him that rescue teams would be looking for survivors, but his instincts warned him that it might be a long time before anyone found them in this devastated landscape. He barked periodically, his voice hoarse from the floodwater he'd swallowed, hoping that someone might hear him. But the only responses were the distant cries of other survivors, too far away to help. Maya stirred as the sun reached its zenith, her eyes opening to slits against the bright light. "Ranger," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dog's tail wagged weakly, and he licked her face with gentle persistence. She was awake. That was something. "Where are we?" she asked, trying to sit up. The movement sent a wave of nausea through her system, and she had to lean against the tree trunk for support. Ranger whined softly, pressing his nose against her hand. He couldn't tell her that they were miles from where they'd started, carried downstream by the flood to a place neither of them had ever seen. He couldn't explain that the familiar landmarks of home had been swept away, leaving them stranded in a world transformed by water and destruction. But he could stay close. He could protect her, and he could keep looking for a way to get them, both to safety. The day grew hotter, and Maya's thirst became a constant torment. The muddy water that surrounded them looked tempting, but even in her weakened state, she knew better than to drink it. Ranger seemed to understand her need, and he began to explore the debris field that had collected around their tree, searching for anything that might help. He found a plastic water bottle, cracked but still containing a few precious ounces of clean water. Using his teeth, he carried it back to Maya, dropping it in her lap with a proud wag of his tail. "Good boy," she whispered, unscrewing the cap with shaking hands. The water was warm and tasted of plastic, but it was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. As the afternoon wore on, Maya's strength returned enough for her to take stock of their situation. They were perched on a small island of debris that had collected around the cottonwood tree, maybe 30 feet from the nearest dry ground. The water was still too deep and fast to attempt crossing, and Maya wasn't sure she had the strength to swim anyway. But Ranger was restless, pacing back and forth on their small refuge, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the intensity of a hunter. Maya realized he was looking for something, or someone. "Elena," she called out, her voice stronger now. "Elena, can you hear me?" The only answer was the distant sound of helicopter rotors, too far away to be searching for them. Maya's heart sank as she realized that Elena might not have survived the flood. The woman who had given her a home, who had made her feel like family for the first time in years, might be gone. The thought was too painful to bear, so Maya pushed it away and focused on the immediate problem of survival. She and Ranger needed food, clean water, and shelter, and they needed to find a way to signal for help. As the sun began to set, painting the devastated landscape in shades of orange and red, Maya heard something that made her blood run cold. A splash, followed by a low, sinuous movement in the water nearby. "Ranger," she whispered, pointing toward the disturbance. The dog's hackles rose as he saw what had caught Maya's attention. A water moccasin, its thick body undulating through. The muddy water was swimming directly toward their refuge. The snake's head was held high above the surface, its eyes fixed on the warm-blooded creatures that had invaded its flood-expanded territory. Ranger positioned himself between Maya and the approaching snake, his body tense with controlled aggression. The dog's police training included encounters with dangerous wildlife, and he knew how to deal with venomous snakes. But in his weakened state, injured and exhausted, he wasn't sure he could protect Maya if the snake decided to attack. The moccasin reached the edge of their debris island and began to climb onto a partially submerged log. Maya held her breath, afraid that any movement might provoke the snake into striking. But Ranger had no such hesitation. With a sharp bark, he lunged forward, snapping at the snake's head with lightning speed. The moccasin recoiled, its mouth opening to reveal pale pink interior and curved fangs. It struck at Ranger, but the dog was ready, dancing back just out of range. The snake tried again, and again Ranger dodged, barking continuously to keep the reptile's attention focused on him and away from Maya. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, the water moccasin seemed to decide that these particular intruders weren't worth the effort. It slithered back into the water and swam away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Maya let out a shaky breath and wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck. "Thank you," she whispered into his fur. "Thank you for protecting me." The dog's tail wagged weakly, but Maya could feel the tremor in his muscles, the exhaustion that was beginning to overwhelm even his legendary determination. He'd been protecting her for almost 24 hours straight, and his body was finally beginning to fail. That night, they huddled together on their small island, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Maya dreamed of the mesa where she and Ranger had shared so many peaceful moments, of Elena's kitchen and the feeling of being truly home for the first time in her life. But she also dreamed of the flood, of the crushing weight of water and the terror of drowning. She woke several times with a start, her heart pounding, only to find Ranger's warm body pressed against her, his presence a comfort in the darkness. The second day brought new challenges. The sun beat down mercilessly and Maya's lips cracked from dehydration. Ranger's tongue lolled from his mouth as he panted, his dark coat absorbing the heat like a solar collector. They needed water, shade, and most importantly, they needed to find a way off their tiny island. It was Ranger who found the solution. As the water level continued to drop, he spotted a partially submerged shopping cart that had been swept downstream by the flood. The metal cart was wedged against a concrete culvert, creating a bridge of sorts between their island and the far shore, but reaching the cart would require swimming through 20 feet of still dangerous water, and Maya wasn't sure she had the strength. Ranger seemed to understand her dilemma. He barked once, a sound that seemed to say, "Trust me," and then plunged into the water. Maya watched in terror as the dog fought against the current, his powerful legs churning through the muddy water. He reached the shopping cart and tested its stability with his weight, then barked again, calling to her. "I can't," Maya called back, her voice weak with exhaustion and fear. "I'm not strong enough." But Ranger didn't accept that answer. He swam back to the island, his movements more labored now, and gently took Maya's hand in his mouth. Not biting, just holding, applying gentle pressure that seemed to say, "Come with me." Maya looked into his eyes and saw something that gave her strength, absolute faith that they could make it together. If Ranger believed they could survive this, then maybe they could. She slipped into the water, gasping at the cold shock, and felt Ranger's solid presence beside her. He swam slowly, accommodating her weakness, staying close enough that she could grab his collar if she needed support. They reached the shopping cart, and Maya hauled herself onto the metal mesh, her muscles screaming with the effort. The cart groaned under their combined weight but held steady. From there, it was a short swim to the concrete culvert, and then finally to solid ground. Maya collapsed on the muddy bank, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. They had made it, they were alive, and they were together. But as she looked out at the devastated landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, Maya realized that their ordeal was far from over. They were lost in a world transformed by the flood, with no food, no clean water, and no way to signal for help. All they had was each other. The helicopter appeared on the horizon like a mechanical angel, its rotors beating a rhythm of hope across the devastated landscape. Maya had been unconscious for most of the third day, her body finally succumbing to dehydration and exhaustion. Ranger lay beside her, his muzzle resting on her chest, his breathing shallow and labored. The dog's ears perked up at the sound of the approaching aircraft, and he struggled to his feet, his injured leg barely supporting his weight. He began to bark, a hoarse sound that took every ounce of his remaining strength, but he kept barking, kept calling to the sky, refusing to give up even as his body failed him. The helicopter circled once, twice, and Maya's heart sank as it seemed to move away. But then it banked sharply and came back, hovering directly overhead. Through the noise of the rotors, Maya heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a human voice amplified by a megaphone. "We see you. Stay where you are. We're coming down." The rescue basket descended from the helicopter like a lifeline from heaven. Maya tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't respond. She was too weak, too dehydrated, too broken by their ordeal. But Ranger was there, pressing his nose against her face, his tail wagging with what little strength he had left. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the helicopter's roar. "We made it, boy. We made it." The paramedic who descended with the basket was a young woman with kind eyes and steady hands. She took one look at Maya's condition and immediately began administering IV fluids, her movements efficient and professional. "What's your name, sweetheart?" she asked as she worked. "Maya," the girl whispered. "Maya Rodriguez, and this is Ranger." The paramedic glanced at the German shepherd who was watching every movement with protective intensity despite his obvious exhaustion. "He's been taking care of you, hasn't he?" Maya nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He saved my life. He pulled me out of the water. He's been protecting me. We'll take good care of both of you," the paramedic promised. "Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere?" Maya tried to take inventory of her body, but everything seemed to hurt. Her shoulder ached where debris had struck her. Her throat was raw from the muddy water she'd swallowed, and her head pounded with dehydration. But she was alive. They were both alive. Getting Ranger into the rescue basket proved to be a challenge. The dog was weak, but still suspicious of strangers, and he refused to leave Maya's side. It was only when Maya whispered to him, telling him it was okay, that he finally allowed the paramedic to help him into the basket beside her. The flight to the hospital was a blur of medical equipment and reassuring voices. Maya drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time she woke, Ranger was there, his warm body pressed against her side despite the paramedic's attempts to give her more room. "He won't leave her," the paramedic explained into her radio. "They've been through hell together. I don't think separating them is going to help anyone right now." The hospital was chaos. The flood had created dozens of casualties, and the emergency room was overwhelmed with injured and displaced people. But Maya and Ranger were rushed into a treatment room where a team of doctors and nurses began working on them both. Maya's condition was serious: severe dehydration, hypothermia, and a shoulder injury that would require surgery. But she was alive, and with treatment, she would recover. Ranger was in better shape physically, but the veterinarian who examined him was concerned about his exhaustion and the infected wound on his leg. "This dog is a hero," the vet said to the nurse. "I've never seen anything like it. He must have been protecting her for days." Elena arrived at the hospital 6 hours later, her face streaked with tears and mud. She'd been trapped by the flood 20 miles downstream, rescued by a National Guard unit after spending 2 days on the roof of a submerged building. When she learned that Maya and Ranger were missing, she'd refused to leave the hospital until she knew their fate. "Maya?" she called out as she burst into the girl's room. "Oh, God! Maya, are you okay?" Maya's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw Elena's face, She began to cry. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "I thought I'd lost you." Elena gathered the girl in her arms, holding her gently because of her injuries. "I'm here," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Ranger, who had been lying on a blanket beside Maya's bed, lifted his head and thumped his tail weakly. Elena reached over and scratched behind his ears, her touch gentle and grateful. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog. "Thank you for bringing her back to me." The doctor who came in to check on Maya was amazed by her condition. "She should be dead," he said quietly to Elena. "Severe dehydration, hypothermia, multiple contusions. But somehow she held on. And that dog—" he shook his head in wonder. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. He must have kept her warm, found her water, protected her from predators. It's extraordinary." Over the next few days, as Maya recovered, the story of her rescue began to spread. Local news crews arrived at the hospital, eager to tell the story of the girl and the dog who had survived the flood together. But Maya wasn't interested in interviews or publicity. All she wanted was to go home with Elena and Ranger, to rebuild their lives together. "The house is gone," Elena explained gently. "Everything we had is gone, but we'll start over. We'll find a new place, and we'll be a family again." Maya nodded, understanding that home wasn't a building or a place. It was the people you loved, the bonds that held you together even when everything else was swept away. On the 4th day, as Maya was finally strong enough to sit up in bed, she noticed that Ranger was acting strangely. The dog kept looking toward the window, his ears perked up as if he was listening for something. "What is it, boy?" she asked. Ranger got up and walked to the window, pressing his nose against the glass. Maya followed his gaze and gasped. In the parking lot below, a crowd had gathered. People were holding signs that read, "Hero Dog" and "Thank You, Ranger." Children pressed their faces against the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of the German shepherd who had captured the world's attention. "They're here for you," Maya said to Ranger, her voice filled with wonder. "They want to thank you for saving me." But Ranger just turned away from the window and walked back to Maya's bed, laying his head on her lap. The praise and attention meant nothing to him. All that mattered was that his girl was safe, that his family was together. "I know," Maya whispered, stroking his fur. "I know you didn't do it for them. You did it for me. Because you love me." Ranger's tail wagged slowly, and he closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest. The ordeal was over. They had survived the flood, survived the wilderness, survived the impossible. And they had done it together. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, but inside the hospital room, all was peaceful. Maya dozed with her hand on Ranger's head. Elena dozed in the chair beside the bed, and the dog who had saved them all finally allowed himself to sleep the deep, peaceful sleep of a job well done. They were safe. They were together. And they were going home. 6 weeks after the flood, Maya stood in front of the mirror in their temporary apartment, adjusting the blue dress that Elena had bought for the ceremony. Her shoulder was still stiff from the surgery, but the doctors said she'd make a full recovery. More importantly, the hollow look that had haunted her eyes for so long was gone, replaced by something that Elena barely dared to name. Hope. "You look beautiful," Elena said from the doorway, her own dress uniform crisp and perfect. She'd been asked to present the award, a recognition of her years of service and the heroism of her former partner. "I still can't believe this is happening," Maya said, turning away from the mirror. "All these people, all this attention. Ranger doesn't even understand what it's about." Elena smiled. "He understands the important parts. He understands that you're safe, that we're a family, that he did what he was supposed to do." In the living room, Ranger was lying on his favorite blanket, wearing a new collar that gleamed with official K9 unit insignia. He'd been groomed for the occasion, his coat brushed to a lustrous shine, but his eyes held the same gentle intelligence that had first captured Maya's heart. The ceremony was being held at the state capitol, and as their car pulled up to the building, Maya's breath caught. Hundreds of people lined the sidewalks, many of them holding signs and banners celebrating Ranger's heroism. Children pressed forward, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous rescue dog. "Hero Dog Saves Girl from Flood," read the headline in the newspaper that Elena had shown her that morning. The story had gone national, capturing the imagination of people across the country who needed to believe in something good, something pure, something that reminded them that love could triumph over disaster.